Today on The Big Story, protests over the environment in London. Could it happen in Singapore? One of Singapore's oldest schools gets a new home. Scientology in Singapore. Two brothers give their take on a controversial church. Good afternoon and welcome to The Big Story, where we discuss the hottest topics of the day and explain to you why it matters. I'm Melissa, coming to you live from the Straits Times newsroom. Now, ignore the threat of climate change at your own risk. That was the message Minister for the Environment and Water Resources, Masagor Zulkifli, said today at the first meeting of scientists from the United Nations climate science body. He said we must not take our eyes off the long-term existential challenge of climate change. Otherwise, citizens will take their cause to the streets and reason will fail to rule. So here's a health report of planet Earth to show what the minister is talking about. Sea levels have risen about 15 cm in the past century. Forests larger than the size of South Africa have disappeared due to deforestation. And up to 1 million species of flora and fauna are at risk of extinction. I'm joined here by the Straits Times Environment and Climate Change experts, Audrey and David. Hi both.
Hi, Melissa.
Hi. So what do you think the minister was trying to say when he said we must not take our eyes off climate change, or the people will take their case to the streets?
So I think Minister was emphasizing the scale of the climate change problem, not just for Singapore, but nations around the world. Today's meeting was the first meeting of the climate scientists under the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in Singapore, and they will be discussing, they will be hamming out some of the details that will be in the next synthesis report for AR6, in which it will synthesize all the climate science research for policymakers to take action. So I think in my experience reporting on climate change, I think this has to be one of Minister's strongest comments on climate change to date, in which he emphasized the scale of the problem. And this also comes on the back of recent global events, including like school strikes for climate and also the Extinction Rebellion in London that we have been seeing recently. So I think all these things are affected into his speech. And also on top of that, we have seen extreme events affecting countries around the world. The most recent would be the tropical cyclones that affected countries around the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans. And there's also been the heat waves in Europe. India as well is suffering from the heat. And melting ice is, I mean, climate change has impacts not just for Singapore but for around the world, and Minister was driving home that point.
Understand. Now, David, Singapore is just a little red dot. So even if our carbon emissions, if we were to bring it down to almost zero, it wouldn't make a difference for global warming, would it?
Well, but that kind of misses the point, because the whole point about climate change is that it's a man-made issue and it's a global issue, and all countries really have to pull their weight, whether they're a top emitter like China or the smallest country. Everybody has to take action, each to their own ability, which is the point of the Paris Climate Agreement. But also, if you're taking part, that means you're part of the global system. And Singapore is very much a big believer and participant in the multilateral system, be it trade, be it economic issues, finance, technology. Singapore wants to play its role, and it sees climate change in exactly the same light. It also plays a key role in the UN climate negotiations, both as a negotiator but also as a facilitator. It likes to play the role of an honest broker, and it's been quite successful in that process. But it also is driven partly by national interest. It helps shape the debate. So Singapore has a say in the future of how climate action evolves, and it also then gives Singapore a chance to promote its vision of how climate change should be, basically what we should do about it. I guess the third thing too is that there are, by being a global player, you also can help I guess understand the economic benefits of tackling climate change, because yes, a lot of people think climate change is a doom and gloom narrative. We've seen, as Audrey has mentioned, the tropical cyclone that hit Japan recently with record flooding, Hurricane Dorian, which hit the northern Bahamas. But also in the process of cutting emissions, which is the bottom line for fighting climate change, is that there are economic benefits as well, such as better investment in renewable energy, so clean energy. Clean energy then also gets rid of the need to import expensive fossil fuels. Burning fossil fuels creates air pollution, apart from obviously CO2, which heats up the atmosphere. Investments in greener buildings, which then cut energy costs. There are lots of things, positive things to be done on climate change. So getting involved in the economic side of that and building an economy around that is also quite a positive thing, and Singapore's also looking at that process.
Audrey, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to highlight that Singapore is also disproportionately vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. I mean, yeah, we can adapt, right? When the heat comes, you just turn up the aircon, but there are some other factors that we cannot adapt against. So things like, for example, as a small island nation, we import more than 90% of our food. So if climate change is wrecking food and water supplies elsewhere, yeah, we have the money, but will the countries actually sell that to us when climate crisis hits? So the fact that Singapore is so reliant on all these imports and all that makes it important that we do our part now, so that we have a greater bargaining voice on the international stage in terms of calling other countries to cut their emissions. And correct me if I'm wrong, David, like that's what the small Pacific Island nations are doing, right? They are trying to do, they are calling on the international players
Absolutely,
to, hey, do your part, because you know we are the ones who are going to suffer the most.
Yeah, they're bearing the brunt, right? I mean, these tiny islands didn't cause climate change. They're not responsible for the planet heating up or these additional extreme events. They're kind of blameless. Yeah. So of course they'll do their bit, but they're asking the bigger emitters to meet the obligations of the Paris Climate Agreement and go for keeping warming up just below 2 degrees or even 1.5, which the UN Climate Panel says is the target to go for, because that will minimize the risks to basically to countries, to economies, to societies.
Yeah, if I could just chime in one more thing. So like we have the biggest emitters in the world, places like the US, the EU, China, India, but a lot of other countries all say that they are contributing negligible amount to the global emissions. So imagine if 175 countries all say the same thing, where would that put us? And also there was this line that I read in a book recently, is that the war cannot be won by one country alone, but it might be lost if not everyone acts. So I think that really emphasizes why every country needs to act, including Singapore, even though we just produce 0.11% of global emissions.
I understand. Thank you both. So long story short, Singapore is a little red dot, but we do have a global impact.
Yes.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
For more stories on the environment and climate change, do log on to the Straits Times website. One of Singapore's oldest schools moved into its brand new home today. For students of the 140-year-old Raffles Girls' School, it's the beginning of a new chapter. Located along Braddell Road, the school is just across from Raffles Institution. Costing $90 million, its new home is about 2.5 hectares or 2.5 football fields larger than its old Anderson Road location. New students will start studying at the new campus next year. And we have Jolene, the journalist who was there this morning. Hi Jolene.
Hi.
So what impressed you the most about the campus?
I was there this morning for the first opening of RGS. So on first glance, actually I was quite surprised. It was a bit unexpected because visually, look-wise, it looked like a university or a polytechnic. Yeah. So for example, some of the facilities that they have there include a performing arts center, which consists of things like an auditorium or a black box, for theatre or drama. There's a dance studio, rooms for music. And also separately, there's a 3-story library actually, which I wasn't able to see for myself, unfortunately, but I heard that the students were actually very excited by it. I think the school tried to have some consultations with the students to get their feedback on what they would have liked to see in the new campus back when they were still at Anderson. And the library was the thing that kept coming up for the students.
They also have something called the Innovation Hub. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
It's a building which consists of things like resources like drones, UAVs, and maybe 3D printers. So the aim is for the students to be kind of exposed to this kind of technology skills, and I think they also have the option to take up optional modules like AI or computing, app or web development, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Now, Jolene, I want to know your opinion. Do you think such brand name schools require such state-of-the-art facilities?
I think, at least in Singapore, there are quite a number of brand name schools that have facilities like these, usually the independent schools. But I think that partly stems from the history of these schools and the very wide alumni base. So, for example, RGS itself, it's about 140 years. I think this year they're celebrating the 140th anniversary. So, just from the history itself, there's a very long line of alumni. And this morning, there were actually quite a number of them who were present at the event. They were invited guests because they were involved some way or another. There was one lady I was sitting next to actually during the ceremony. She was part of the choir when she was a student at RGS, and she helped out with the fundraising by volunteering with a group of her batchmates to come up with a cookbook, and then they sold it. So firstly to their friends, and then like through word of mouth, and that's how they raised money. So the alumni spirit, I think, was very strong. Yeah, similarly for other schools, not just RGS. Yeah, but I guess one point to note is that all of these schools, even though they have the privilege to have all these facilities, they also they have a part to play themselves. Like for RGS, they after moving to Bredel, they started this mentorship program where they kind of match their own students. I think it's their Sec 2 students to primary school students who are around the area. And the aim is to kind of encourage more girls from less privileged families to enter RGS when they're of age. Yeah. And facilities wise, I also hear that RGS is planning to open them up to the public in time to come. So I think the school field and even the Performing Arts Centre. Yeah. So I think that's a good start.
Thank you so much, Jolene.
Thank you.
Now, not much is known about Scientology in Singapore, except for its celebrity followers, Tom Cruise and John Travolta. And now the Ong brothers from Singapore.
Okay, I'm not brainwashed.
This is one of the biggest joke. You are not supposed to be brainwashed. How to brainwash you? We're not supposed to be more aware and more awake after that. In fact, the founder, L. Ron Hubbard, he mentioned very, very clearly what he said are his opinion. If you disagree with it, that's fine. Don't agree with it.
Yeah, as an old timer, I have come across quite a number of things, and when I study, I say I don't agree with that. So the supervisor or the course room say, fine, that's your understanding, and so it be. So I just put it one side, park one side. This idea, I don't agree. Move on.
For the full video, you can watch it on the Straits Times website. But for now, let's look at the science behind Scientology in Singapore with journalist Yuan Sin, who wrote the story. Hi, Yuan Sin.
Hello.
Hi. I'd like to know, why do you think some people find Scientology controversial?
Yeah, I guess part of the reason could be that it's such a new religion. Like no one has heard of what it is at all. And so maybe let me take some time to give you a bit of background there on Scientology and what it is. So it was founded in 1950 by a science fiction writer called L. Ron Hubbard, and I think he's fairly well known. So it believes that people are basically immortal spiritual beings, right? And their minds have they have been obscured by traumatic events in the past. So through a series of causes and kind of like mental therapy sessions known as auditing, you can use that to overcome these obstacles and attain a higher state of like spiritual existence in a sense. And I guess part of the criticism level against Scientology is that, well, it could be seen as pseudotherapy used to replace the methods of like psychology and psychiatries. And also they feel that it's just a scam to make more money off believers. So these are some of the criticisms level at it. And also during the period of the 50s to 70s, right, the American countercultural movement also started to, gain, more followers. So this was also at a time when there were a lot of suspicions about new religions and cults. So that could be why it is seen as controversial. And also in recent years, you get a lot of celebrities who have joined Scientology in the past, but now they've defected from the church, and they have all kinds of accusations against the church. That it breaks up families. There've also been lawsuits from ex-members alleging sexual abuse or forced labor and so on. And we're not very sure if any of these allegations are true, but that's what is being widely reported in the Western media right now.
So on the flip side, why do you think some people are attracted to Scientology, like the Ong brothers you spoke to?
Yeah, and also I guess Scientology belongs to this larger category of so-called new religious movements. So it's actually a term that has been coined by academics to refer to new spiritual or religious movements that emerged over the last century. So other groups that may be considered by some academics to fall into this category would be the Hare Krishnas, which is kind of like an offshoot of Hinduism, or the Jehovah's Witnesses, which I think many people know a bit about by reading online and so on, right? And it can be difficult to shoehorn them into the same category also because they have very diverse practices and beliefs. So some of them have origins in traditional religion, but they have wanted to kind of branch out to kind of revive a tradition. And some of them, like Scientology, may have decided, well, that they just wanted to start a new religion, right? And NRMs may have gained popularity at a time when, I guess during the post-war period, society modernized and it went through a lot of changes as well. And there was also the advance of science and technology, right? So all these developments may have also made people feel that traditional religion may not be as relevant or applicable to their daily life. Or some people may just feel that they don't really subscribe to the ritualistic, practice of traditional religion. So for example, an academic has said that in Singapore there's this movement known as the Satya Sai Baba movement. So people are drawn to him. He's an Indian spiritual guru, and it places a lot of emphasis on community service, right? So it seems like a very practical way of applying your religious beliefs compared to traditional religions, which may be more ritualistic in nature. And some NRMs also engage with the development of science and technology in very creative ways. So if you look at Scientology, right, I believe the Ong brothers were drawn to it partially because it seems to kind of offer a very rational and scientific approach to overcoming obstacles in life, as opposed to older religions which kind of like have a bit more of a dogma and element of faith or like preaching or believing in something more abstract.
Well said, Yuan Xin. I believe people are free to believe what they want to believe, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So those were our top stories for today. For more news and videos, do head on to our website at straitstimes.com. Once again, I'm Melissa, and thank you for tuning in. Join us tomorrow for more stories on The Big Story.